erectiles coordinates to polar
Hey there,
coordinates.
welcome to another video. In the last video, I showed you how to convert.
So we're gonna help Leonard here. We're actually gonna want to help. Okay? So when we're talking about the rectangle coordinates into you're now at north at this position on Earth. Because that becomes, I know it seems like it's overfundamental, but that's math, right? It's the nature, what's in here. This is this backwards. I'm looking at it from this perspective or the other person's perspective. I have money and I'm doing this. I don't have money and I'm doing this on Earth. Polar coordinates, something like that.
Convert between polar coordinates and rectangular coordinates of a point. Same point, different representations. In this video, I'm going to teach you how to go between
start with the globe on 9.8 meters per second, because it doesn't matter if it was Alpha Centauri polar, that X would be still within 9.8 meters per second from this square to this square, which would be rectangles. And if you're part of the class, it's like lines are 2 points, which are a triangulation, which then like this dimensional axis opens up and this becomes a square. But by doing that, it does it in other places too, ones and zeros in computers. But it's a hot mess. You don't know where the Arduino pops up because there's a lot of them. They're all a bunch of, alright, so if it did this and I lock that into the boson and this one into Maxwell's and Raylight over here, you would be looking at the spread out wave function here. This is the scatter pattern, interference pattern, mathematics interference. And because of the machinery we use, it makes EM noise. Sine, cosine, trig, Bell, Leonard.
Very, very nicely.
Polar coordinates going to help us graph these coordinates. So it's tough for kids to understand as this is going to go real fast. What he's doing is this. It is by steps. But this is also a pursuit algorithm. This is also rabbit population in the calc. What do you mean? It's like, well, what is negative positive calc? When I'm pen zeroing this line here, it becomes a rectangle here because it's offset. It's 1 to 2. 1 to 2 on 1. So what 500,000 is on here could be one unit. And in Earth, polar coordinates, this photon, sine to cosine, or sine indifferent. So you go prime, usually just the A prime. They go by sectors because it turns into like sigma. A prime for our class, first step, two step from orientation, 0, 0, 0, 1, 1, 1, 2.
We have to remember what tan inverse does. Tangent inverse only works.
It basically tells me.
To pi over 2. So a couple things.
I'm a carpenter now. Pi over 2. Find the concrete pour.
Only works.
And so if you start from concrete pour, this becomes easy. How to convert those stonemason learning how to do concrete pour in half of this, like on the 45 has to lens, well, you go A to Z. You go A to Z on north. So if you'd say the write out is actually a shift in internal housing lattice structure of that bookwork,
tangent inverse will not
you're
give you that angle.
Doing Fermilab by
only give you angles from 4 to 1. That's what tangent.
It works 9.8 meters per second because we do calculus. It's a shadow problem. Remember, as math teachers, you have to do it from. You might be, but pi is first. Pi is 1/2 and 1/2 YF over X. However you wanna. If I see a snowflake, and this is beautiful about calc, fall this way in the same amount of time, let's say you could house it, of the shift. They are tangent, they are cosine, they are YF over X. And once I get that T in this quadrant, this lensing to positive, positive, negative, negative, or is this negative, negative? This is negative, positive, but I need it negative, positive. If you're not very good with math, I need to actually use this or know the square on certain things to be able to position what mass, charge, composition. Let's look at it right here. And go back in time here.
rectangular
what I
coordinates
prepped the class.
and polar coordinates for a point. There's really not a lot to it beside understanding exactly
the ones who do this often, and I mean it's weird actions at Spooky Distance Science,
as we go through, I'll be explaining everything again.
Can't prove it, Heisenberg.
But because this was not really super concrete, because we have an example, it'll make more sense.
The physics is math, and math is chemistry.
The first thing we're going to do
it's all psychology,
is identify
really.
what sort of a representation we have. Do we have rectangular or do we have
And I don't know which one the one.
Sometimes it's very difficult to tell, especially with something like 3-0.
Kid, you'd come in. You know I'm probably this. He's probably this. What's left on the board for you to fill?
Now it doesn't.
What IH goes in there for a name that you like? Now it's not different. It's different in the mill because I'm going to tell you the saw is open, the skid steer guy is open. I'm not saying that they don't. It's probably in the same way reserved on this line instead of being in charge of calculus as a whole. But there you go. If it becomes the photon in there, usually they do as mathematician standards, but the problem is, you remember, the trick is to maintain 0 here, not a stone mill. If I do a stone mill, I'm going to lose all the bakers. But it's all calculus of students, right? C++. I set it on a curve. If they're getting C when I got an A, why don't they figure it out on the dual diagnosis, derivative L, derivative T, AU, AG?
Well,
I mean, you can do it a lot of different ways.
What the R was and what the theta was before we
carbon
did
bonds.
Any work on it. We're going to do the same thing here. Our X is 3
dry eraser,
and our Y is 0. After we do that, after we identify what X and Y are, we plot our point. So X being 3 and Y equals 0, because we have this rectangular coordinate system, just really handy for us, we're going to plot the point at 3, 0.
Well, there's a trick with prime numbers why 3 is useful.
Now, that's right on the
He did it right here.
That would be like a quadrangle, really, if we're talking polar coordinates. We're not yet, but
0?
if we were, that'd be a quadrangle.
Oh, excuse me, 0, 1, 2, and negative 1 on the other side. So I'm really still getting the 4. Inside here, it's talking about 0 here, I'd imagine, right? And looking forward, I'm thinking back about PSTDs, and that's this little square right here. If I can photon that, it's generalized. It's not perfect units, their dimensional analysis is the sections at 3. That's right.
Otherwise, we'll switch back and forth between quadrants that we
the
don't
difference
so we're going to take the positive
is trying to get you guys to recognize when a kid doesn't do this. -1, square root of -1. And there's lots of ways you can do it. One of the simple ones in math is just being obvious about this. What does this mean to you? Break and jar conjecture. If you had to put what you needed this to do, what you wanted to do in the future, they are the same numbers. This, the way we're talking about it in chemistry is, well, it's a lithium battery and I need lithium. Well, there's a refining process that you have to Engling's oil angle for. But you'd messy this board all up. This is tight and clean. I like the direct. I think it brings... You have to be dynamic. I'm going to get the stone mill, and at the end of the day, if I just had an ROT guy watching me on the stone mill, you could do the graph, you could say the numbers, the vector position, NTF beginnings, cosmic backgrounds, square roots, generalized, we all get the area, it's lensed by the penguins in Antarctica. But you can messy this all up with some dotted lines to the center of this, that doing up here in optics and A-level physics stuff. It's a process to get there. I shouldn't want to, yes, and then dot that in there, because this thing would be a hot mess. And that's not what I do in the stone mill. What I do in the stone mill is I have cants, 12 foots, 10 foots, 9 foots, 4x6s. I have 1 inch, usually coming down, but if the saw is set to a certain thing, we have only a limit of, we could do, if we did all the types of wood that we could do, thicknesses, widths, cants, off of any standard model, there wouldn't be enough pallets in there and the chain whip and shipping everything out to that really tight operator of integrals. We're integrating certain, we'll hedge out like a bit of the diamond necklace right here, right, and we'll change an operation, but it didn't change clock in procedures, didn't change clock out procedures, didn't change why the contract to jump in the loader and still work the rock is worth 15 across the board for new rookies. because that new rookie security is some risks out of it. This is not 90 days, even if I hired Leonard as my calculus guy. Why?
Thing to think about is
if you do it,
so
and you did it for 15, one, you can understand equity of what this should put you to be. And if you did it because the devil, here you put me in the snowflake right here, put a little blink, wink, tone, frequency, however you want to play with it. It's as Oppenheimer. He could tell you, bring on the multi-form hand to become the prince, and I'll tell you a story about Valentine Rabbit. You know, you get beat up, you get tore up, this is in the joints. I'm seeing the mill pretty much ready to wrench me because this brother's coming at me, and I feel the building gonna hurt. I can't replace that dude. I can't do anything about it. Or I couldn't. He's kicking like a mule. Usually you got the law behind it. It's like the system of what kids do when they do it this way.
Furthermore, I want to talk just a little bit about the reason
what's your thesis? What do you want to rectangle coordinates, the polar coordinates?
You see, the problem is this. Y over x, when we compare
obviously
y over
he's
x,
picked students and
YouTube
and invert pilot theory. Inverse, they say inverse.
X,
I need the general. When we're talking in the positive form, I need Minkowski in space, Leonard space here. You did that. It was an R over 3, 2. The square root of negative 49 Wolfram alpha is the saws. What I mean, I walked in that morning, there was 2 stacks, broke down into it, she was hung up in there and locked like that. Now, how did I get negative square root, the square root of negative 49 on paper? There's a universe for it. I understand it well enough to just cheat and say, if I worked at it and prettied it up, I will make that number 49 by adding A and B in the correct proportions off of roll for stamina D&D board. And that's a math game. They look a lot like these. And so get a person that kind of understands it. Listen, fire. This is a weapon now for you. Treat it like a weapon, great power, great responsibility. Statistical analysis of problem in courtrooms.
Would be an angle of 0 and an R of 3. It's the same exact point. It just has a different representation. And so we can write it a little bit differently.
Why do you do push-ups later?
Same, but it means something different. We're still going to write 3, 0. The way we write polar coordinates is R
in the spectrum of how you do this. You kind of look, I'm going to graph you. Just when the D&D board comes out, I mean, watch out. Because I'm going to work a character card, constitution, physics. It's like one of 3 physics questions. How do you do the plasticity of the steel bolt on the skid steer? It's like, if the service rating on an M1 is correct, it'll rust 0 before it'll snap, and just the weight of the thing sitting on it. As long as I serviced every other part perfectly in thermodynamics. They hit and bump. How do I know? Because actually the Spooky Distances put that bolt shear with full buckets going over there to dump it, and I usually have never heard any other combination of tones and frequencies coming up in that mill other than that spot for it. Now, let's say it did happen somewhere else. Do you imagine that the criteria, what they were doing, was the same level to shear that bolt on the forks?
Calculus, I would encourage you to give it a chance.
Okay, we're going to move on.